least a minimum training on abuse issues within the first 6 months of employment, and then you have to repeat it every 5 years. Okay, so there are specific time frames involved in that. If you are not a mandatory reporter, by law we are permissive. So even though I'm not mandated to report, I legally have permission to report. Okay, so if your heart hurts, do something about it. If you're a mandatory reporter and you're off duty, you're not working, you have permission to report. Okay, so you're not mandated to do that. So then who reports? Whoever discovers the abuse, whoever suspects the abuse makes the report. And this has kind of gone all over the chart. It used to be that the person that suspected or discovered the abuse had to report it to a supervisor who passed it on up the food chain to a top administration who made the decision whether to report or not. That's against the law. It's not up to them to make a decision to report or not report. It's up to them to report. So the law changed that said whoever suspects or discovers, they have to make the report. Well, then it was a problem. I'm upset with where I work, and so, I'm going to report abuse, and they're going to get in trouble. So we had a bit of a problem with that. So now it is, if I discover it, at least I need to tell my supervisors, my employer, my agency, I need to tell them I'm in the process of making an abuse report. Potentially get help doing it so that they're working with me on the report, but it still is nobody's right to be able to stop that report. The report has got to go in based on suspected abuse. It's just let's work together to know, how's this going to happen, who's going to be doing it. Okay, so then when do you report? Immediately? The definition of immediate is 24 hours. So you need to do it at least verbally within 24 hours. I recommend that you take time to write everything out first so that when you're making that verbal report, you're going to know what you want to say, you're going to remember everything you remember about that case, that you're going to have it all written out to make that report. And then it has to be in writing within 48. Okay, I have several friends who are still in the field that are saying if they take time to, when they go to call it in, if they also say, what is your fax number or what is your website, and they send it in at the same time that they're talking about it, so you have verbal and written, they actually are finding more cases being accepted, especially with dependent adult abuse, because of learning skills, both hearing and visual. Okay, and so they're finding more cases that are being at least investigated with it. If at any time that you are upset, you're worried about your own safety or the safety of a child or a dependent adult, so if there is a risk that you're going to be injured, there are angry caregivers, there are threats, call law enforcement. Get them involved right up front. They can protect the child, they can protect the dependent adult, they can protect you. Okay, so make sure that if there's any risk, any even feeling, that gut instinct again, that there's a potential of a problem, call law enforcement. But then likewise, remember, they may not know a lot about your level of care. They may not know if you're institution facility-based. They may never have been inside in their job. So they may not understand some of the language, the problems. If it's at home, they may not understand your responsibility as an employee in a home situation. And so you may need to educate law enforcement about what's the problem, what do you need in that case. As far as how do you document, it can be with a form. It can be a letter to whom it may concern. It can be with a specific form. This one happens to be the Linn County Senior Coalition, just because I liked the way it was set up, I liked the way that questions were arranged. But you do have a copy of both child abuse reporting forms from Human Services and a dependent adult abuse form, so you can use a form. In fact, it probably is a good idea because then you're not going to skip anything. You're going to make sure that you have everything down that you need to make that report. If we have enough evidence to say that the abuse has happened, it is going to be a founded report, child and dependent adult abuse. That perpetrator's name is going to be on the Central Abuse Registry for the next 10 years. And it's potentially not a one-time only shot. So say 5 years into that 10-year period of time, the perpetrator re-abuses a new victim, the same victim, and we have evidence, 10 years starts over again. And so it can be an ongoing, that they won't work with children or dependent adults. It is part of a criminal background check. They will not be able to work, if they have a hit, they will not be able to work with children or dependent adults for at least a 10-year period of time. There are some other legal issues and ins and outs that I'm not going to cover. Understand you do have rights. If you are being charged as a perpetrator, you do have rights. Ask for some help to work your way through those things. Only exception to it, like with the founded, that it being on the registry, someone that's denying their own care, that personal self-neglect, they're both the perpetrator and the victim. So those cases will just be maintained in either DHS or DIA office, in case there continues to be problems and it escalates. They won't be on the registry. There are times that it's minor, it's an accident, it's isolated, it's not likely to reoccur. Most of the time we're talking about a very minor physical injury like a scratch, a minor bruise, something that you could have prevented it, but it really fits that accident, it's not going to happen again. It could be that you're not getting the right foods, although you're not being neglected to the point of not eating. It could be in clothing with denial of critical care that may not be the right thing for that person. So anything that would be considered in that accident category, minor, isolated, and unlikely to reoccur. It's going to be, yes, we know it happened. They're going to confirm that it happened. That name, the person's name, will not be on the abuse registry for 10 years. They're going to hang on to all of that caseload, all that information, in case something happens again. Then it would obviously step over the category of it's not isolated, it has reoccurred. Okay, so there's another level in there that yes, it happened, but in fact your employment may not be jeopardized with a confirmed situation. And then it doesn't mean it didn't happen, but there are times we just don't have enough evidence. There are times that we haven't preserved it, or we don't have the right people coming forth, or it isn't there to meet the requirements. And so it may be unconfirmed, unfounded. Okay, these are the most frustrating cases because we feel it happened, we were there, we saw it, we heard it, we've reported it, and they come back as unfounded. If you truly believe that abuse has happened, call it in again. Ask to speak to a supervisor. If you still want to challenge it, ask to speak to the director of the State Department of Human Services or Inspections and Appeals. Take it farther up the scale to make sure if you truly believe that it happened. If you are a mandatory reporter and you have failed to make the report, you can be charged. Just failure to making the report can be charged. It is a simple misdemeanor. Now, how serious is that? Well, a simple misdemeanor, if you have your dog outside and they're not on a leash, you can be charged with a simple misdemeanor. So we're not talking, a felony. We're not talking about a major charge. It can be up to $650. It can be up to 3 days in jail. And obviously, they could change those at any time to extend the period of time and the money. So don't take that risk. Give the report. The other thing that you can be charged with is you can be charged with whatever happens to the child or the dependent adult from the time you knew about it and didn't report until someone else knew about it and did. So if I'm taking care of Harvey today and I am aware that he's being beaten and I fail to report it, and you find out about it next Monday, and you make that report, if it can be proven that I had access to that information, I knew it, and I didn't report it, I can be held legally liable for damages done to Harvey from today to next Monday. What if he's beaten to death? Potentially, I'm responsible for wrongful death. And so you have legal obligations to make those reports. Community abuse. So if you're not licensed under the Department of Inspections and Appeals, your services are out in the community, or say that it's visitors coming in, it's something that's community related, the call goes to the Department of Human Services. It can be put on their website. I still recommend you call it in within 24 hours, even if you're putting a report on their website. Okay? That would be Department of Human Services. Until July of this year, there were multiple regional offices and numbers that you could call to make those reports. Starting July of 2010, you only have one phone number to call, and that is a one state hotline or central point of entry with it. Okay, so you have to call the main number, their hotline with it. Department of Inspections and Appeals, remember they license healthcare centers, hospitals, nursing facilities, assisted living, adult daycare, and adult group homes. Okay, and so you need to call them if it's anything to do with abuse where you work or is you a patient, if you're involved in any licensed facility. I have a couple short scenarios and I'm done. I already talked about my 2-year-old, was 18 months, my grandson that was being abused in daycare. Fortunately, they got him out. They've changed daycare providers, and he's just absolutely the happiest little kid that he was before. You know, all that fear, it just isn't there anymore. So fortunately, he hadn't been involved in abuse long enough for it to be an everyday, lasting type of problem. I do have 5 children. 2 are biologically mine, 3 are stepchildren. All 5 of my kids are victims of child abuse. My 2 with their father, Tom's 3 with their mother, all 5 of my kids. When one of my guys was 14, he said he needed to talk to me. He said, Mom, I don't know if I dreamed it or if it really happened. He said, I was running up a flight of steps, knowing I had to get to you before Dad got to me, or I was going to be hurt again. He said, did I just dream that, or did that happen? I said, honey, you were 4 years old, and it was the last night we lived with your father. He thought about it a minute, and he said, Mom, I don't need to talk about it anymore. I remember. He was 4 the last time it happened. He was 14 the one and only time he's discussed that situation or those situations with either my husband or I. The other 4 kids have never talked about it to either my husband or I. All 5 kids are married. All 5 kids have shared the information with their spouse. I know because the spouse have come to me saying, Di, how do I help them through this? All 5 of my children have kids of their own. They know the statistics since I've been teaching this for a long time. They know they have a 50% chance of becoming an abusive adult because of their background. My dad has always been my hero. You know, I was the first person in my family to go on to any education beyond high school. Every time I changed jobs, my dad would always say, honey, give me a tour. I want to see what you're doing. My mom had died early on. My dad had remarried. They lived in Arizona. You know, when my dad became a dependent adult, he did not call and tell me about it, even though he knew that this was my soapbox. A neighbor called to tell me that my stepmother and a stepsister, who is a registered nurse, were deliberately starving my dad to death. When I got down there the next morning, my dad, who had been 6 feet tall 5.5 months earlier, was down to 4.5. Because of dehydration and starvation and contractures, he'd gotten to the point where he was all curled up. My dad could not stand upright to talk to me face to face, to look at me. I had to kneel down on the carpet to look up to my dad to talk to him. My dad had been 175 pounds 6 months earlier. He was down to 115. He had lost 60 pounds in under 6 months. He had reached what's called critical mass, meaning we're going to try for survival. He probably won't make it. The hospital said if he survived, they would deal with the abuse. My dad had a pressure sore and ulcer the size of a grapefruit on his tailbone, his coccyx. My dad died. There was $185,000 missing from his bank account upon his death. So normally we find more than one type of abuse, not just one when we're dealing with, especially with adults. If that can happen to my grandchildren, my children, and my dad, when this has been my soapbox for over 30 years, you need to make this personal. What's happening in your families? Have you even thought about, is there a child that you haven't seen outside? I know it's hot, but you haven't seen them outside so far? What about a dependent adult? Have you seen them in and out? Have you seen activity? Have you seen changes? Something that, trips you off that you need to make that report? What about your job sites? Because I can guarantee that those of you that are watching this film, within the next 3 to 6 months, at least one of you is going to come across a problem in your own family, your own neighborhood, your community, or at work. This isn't even part of my job. I continue to teach because of what's happened to my grandson, my children, and my dad. Make it personal and do something about it. Be aware, get the job done.